The harsh fluorescent lights of the makeup trailer did nothing to improve Tom Hardy's mood. He sat in the worn leather chair, watching his reflection as the makeup artist worked to cover the dark circles under his eyes. 3 hours of sleep wasn't enough, not when you were shooting 12-hour days on a psychological thriller that demanded every ounce of emotional energy you possessed. "You're all set, Mr. Hardy," the makeup artist said, stepping back to admire her work. Tom nodded, managing a tired smile. She was new to the crew, and he could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness around him. 15 years in the spotlight had taught him to recognize the signs. As he pushed open the trailer door, the crisp autumn air of northern England hit his face. The production had taken over an abandoned Victorian asylum for the film, and the Gothic architecture loomed against the steel-gray sky. Perfect for a story about a detective investigating a series of mysterious disappearances, less perfect for Tom's current state of mind. "Tom!" A voice called out from behind him. "Got a minute?" He turned to see Michael Chen, the film's director, jogging toward him. Michael was new to the Hollywood scene, but his independent films had caught the attention of several major studios. This was his first big-budget production, and Tom had been impressed by his vision and attention to detail. "Sure, what's up?" Tom fell into step beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of his wool coat. "I want to introduce you to James. He's going to be working closely with you on the emotional aspects of your character." Michael gestured toward a man standing near the building's entrance, his lean frame wrapped in a charcoal peacoat. Tom's initial reaction was irritation. He'd been acting for nearly 2 decades, had multiple awards under his belt, and now they wanted to saddle him with some acting coach. But as they drew closer, something in James's stance, the quiet confidence, the lack of the usual industry pretense, caught his attention. James turned, and Tom felt an unexpected jolt in his chest. The man's eyes were a striking shade of green, set in a face that seemed to hold both gravity and humor in equal measure. He extended his hand, and Tom noted the ink-stained fingers of a writer. "James Barrett," he said, his voice carrying a slight Irish lilt. "I'm the script consultant Michael brought in to help develop the psychological aspects of the character." "Script consultant?" Tom raised an eyebrow, shaking the offered hand. "I thought we were locked on the script weeks ago." "We were," Michael cut in, "but James has some insights into the psychology of trauma and isolation that I think could add layers to your performance. He's a former psychologist who turned to screenwriting. I worked with him on my last film." Tom wanted to object. Changing elements of the character this far into production was risky, but there was something in James's steady gaze that made him pause. This wasn't the usual Hollywood yes man, eager to please and quick to agree with whatever the star wanted. "Why don't we grab coffee?" James suggested. "I've got some thoughts about your character's relationship with isolation that might interest you." Later, Tom would look back on this moment as the pivot point, the instant when his carefully constructed world began its subtle shift. But standing there in the weak autumn sunlight, all he felt was a mixture of professional curiosity and an odd, unnamed pull toward this stranger with the writer's hands and psychologist's eyes. "Yeah, all right," he heard himself say. "There's a decent place just off-set." The coffee shop was a tiny establishment that had somehow survived the area's economic decline. Tom chose it specifically because the elderly owner had no idea who he was and treated him like any other customer. As they settled into a corner booth, the familiar scent of roasted beans and aged wood wrapping around them, Tom found himself studying James's face. "So," Tom said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug, "tell me about these insights of yours." James leaned forward, his own coffee untouched. "Your character, David, isn't just investigating disappearances. He's investigating the nature of absence itself. Every person who vanishes leaves behind a negative space, a void that shapes the world around it. I think we need to explore how that resonates with David's own experience of emptiness." The words hit Tom with unexpected force. He'd been playing complex characters for years, diving deep into their psyches, but something about James's perspective struck a chord he hadn't known existed within himself. "You're talking about more than just loneliness," Tom said slowly. You're talking about the way we construct ourselves around absences. Exactly. James's eyes lit up, and Tom found himself leaning in, drawn by the other man's intensity. We're all shaped by what's missing as much as by what's present. David's investigation becomes a mirror, reflecting back his own carefully hidden voids. They talked for hours, the coffee growing cold between them. James's understanding of human nature went far beyond academic psychology. He spoke about emotion and identity with a depth that made Tom question his own carefully maintained public persona. As the autumn day faded into evening, Tom realized he'd completely lost track of time. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his agent and a text from Michael asking where they'd disappeared to. Christ, Tom ran a hand over his face. We should head back. James nodded, but neither of them moved immediately. There was a weight to the moment, a significance Tom couldn't quite name. Finally, James stood, gathering his coat. Same time tomorrow, he asked. There's more I'd like to discuss about David's character arc. Tom hesitated. Something was shifting inside him, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of his consciousness. The professional part of his brain said this was about the role, about creating a better performance. But another part, a part he'd spent years ignoring, recognized that whatever was happening here went beyond the script. Yeah, he said, standing. Same time tomorrow. As he watched James walk away through the gathering dusk, Tom felt the first tremors of what would become an earthquake in his life. He just didn't know it yet. That night, lying in his hotel room, Tom stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the restless energy coursing through him. He'd connected with colleagues before, had intense creative discussions that lasted hours, but this felt different. James's words about absence and negative space kept echoing in his mind, along with the memory of green eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facades. His phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend in London, asking about his day. Tom started to type a response, then stopped, suddenly aware of the gap between what he wanted to say and what he could say. How could he explain that a stranger had walked into his life and made him question everything he thought he knew about himself? The cursor blinked accusingly on the empty text field. Finally, he wrote back, long day of shooting. Talk tomorrow. It wasn't a lie, but it felt like one. Rolling over, Tom pressed his face into the pillow and tried to quiet his racing thoughts. Tomorrow, he told himself, everything would make sense in the morning light. But deep down, in the places he rarely allowed himself to examine, he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The Victorian asylum loomed in the distance, its spires piercing the night sky like accusations. Somewhere in its shadowy corridors, they would soon be filming scenes about a detective searching for missing persons. But right now, in the quiet of his room, Tom Hardy was beginning to realize that the real mystery might be the pieces of himself he'd never known were missing. The following weeks brought a fundamental shift in Tom's world, subtle at first, like watching colors slowly saturate a black and white photograph. His daily meetings with James became the axis around which everything else revolved, though he tried to convince himself it was purely professional dedication. They had fallen into a routine. Every afternoon, between scenes, they would meet in what the crew had dubbed the chapel, a small, abandoned prayer room in the asylum's east wing. The space, with its dusty stained glass windows and remnants of wooden pews, seemed to exist outside of time. Here, their conversations wandered far beyond the scope of the script. Tell me about the moment you knew you wanted to be an actor, James said one day, sitting cross-legged on a worn cushion they'd brought in. Autumn rain drummed against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around them. Tom leaned against a stone pillar, contemplating. It wasn't a single moment, he said finally. It was more like finding a language I didn't know I could speak. Everything I couldn't say in regular life, I could say through characters. James's eyes held his with that unnervingly direct gaze. And what can't you say now, Tom? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Tom felt his heart rate quicken, the way it did before an intense scene. But this wasn't acting. This was something raw and real that frightened him more than any role ever had. "I should get back to set," he said, pushing off from the pillar. James didn't move to stop him, but Tom felt his gaze follow him to the door. That evening, Tom's girlfriend Charlotte arrived unexpectedly from London. She swept into his hotel room in a whirlwind of Chanel perfume and well-intentioned energy, talking about missing him and needing to escape the city's chaos. "You look different," she said, studying his face as they lay in bed later that night. "There's something." "Just tired," Tom interrupted, rolling away to check his phone. There was a message from James, "The chapel tomorrow. Found something interesting in the old patient records that might help with David's backstory." Charlotte's arm slipped around his waist from behind. "Let's go into town tomorrow. I saw this lovely little antique shop on the way in." "Can't," Tom said, too quickly. "Got a full day of shooting. And script work." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. He'd never been dishonest with Charlotte before, their relationship had always been built on straightforward communication. But how could he explain that the thought of missing his afternoon with James made his chest physically ache? The next day's shoot was brutal. Tom couldn't focus, flubbing lines he knew by heart. Michael called cut for the 5th time, concern evident on his face. "Everything all right?" the director asked during a break. "You seem distracted." Tom nodded tersely, avoiding Michael's knowing look. The director had worked with James before. Did he see something Tom wasn't ready to acknowledge? When he finally made it to the chapel that afternoon, James was already there, surrounded by yellowed paper spread across the floor. "Patient admission records from the 1890s, James explained, looking up with that smile that made Tom's stomach flip. "The stories here, they're incredible. Listen to this one. Patient claims to be living 2 lives simultaneously, one in darkness and one in light, unable to reconcile the 2 halves of himself." Tom sank down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from James's body. "Sounds familiar," he muttered. James set down the papers, turning to face him fully. "Does it?" The air between them crackled with unspoken words. Tom could feel himself standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. It would be so easy to lean forward, to close the distance that seemed to shrink with each passing day. Instead, he picked up one of the papers, pretending to read. "Charlotte's in town," he said, the words falling like stones between them. "Ah." James's voice was carefully neutral. "How long is she staying?" "A few days. She wants to see the filming." "Tom." James's voice was soft but insistent. "Look at me." He did, because he couldn't not look. James's eyes were serious, the usual humor replaced by something deeper, more urgent. "Whatever this is," James gestured between them, "I won't push. But I need you to know that I'm not imagining it." Tom's breath caught in his throat. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, speaking in metaphors and character analyses, using the script as a shield. But here it was, laid bare in the dusty light of their sanctuary. "I can't," Tom whispered, but he didn't move away. "James, I can't. Can't. Or won't." The question echoed in the chapel's hollow space. Tom stood abruptly, papers scattering around his feet. "I have a life. A career. People have expectations. And what do you expect from yourself?" James's voice followed him to the door. "When did you last ask yourself that question?" Tom paused, hand on the doorknob. The answer was never. He'd been playing roles for so long, the tough guy, the action hero, the devoted boyfriend, that he'd forgotten to question whether they fit anymore. That night, lying beside a sleeping Charlotte, Tom pulled out his phone and typed James's name into Google. The search revealed a modest but impressive career, psychology papers published in respected journals, a handful of critically acclaimed indie film scripts, a few literary awards. But it was a quote from an interview that caught his eye. "The most profound transformations often begin with a single moment of honest terror, that instant when we realize we're not who we thought we were." Tom closed the browser, but the words stayed with him, pulsing like a second heartbeat. Outside his window, the asylum's Gothic towers stretched toward the stars, their shadows a reminder of all the lives that had been confined within its walls. Lives shaped by fear, by society's expectations, by the terror of being different. He thought of the patient from the 1890s, living two lives, unable to reconcile them. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to consider that maybe, just maybe, the only thing more terrifying than acknowledging his feelings for James would be spending the rest of his life pretending they didn't exist. Dawn was breaking when Tom finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with green eyes and the echoing space of an empty chapel, waiting to be filled with truth. The breaking point came during a scene Tom hadn't expected to find challenging. His character, David, was supposed to break down after discovering a vital clue about one of the missing persons. It should have been straightforward. Tom had done emotional scenes countless times before. But standing in the asylum's corridor, surrounded by the crew and harsh lighting, he couldn't access the emotions he needed. Cut. Michael called for the 7th time. Tom, what's going on? This isn't like you. Tom ran his hands through his hair, frustration building in his chest. From the corner of his eye, he could see James watching from behind the monitors, his presence both comforting and destabilizing. Give me a minute, Tom muttered, walking off set. He found himself in a small side room, its walls still covered in peeling institutional green paint. His breath came in short gasps, and he recognized the signs of an oncoming panic attack, something he hadn't experienced since his early days in the industry. The door opened quietly behind him. He knew it was James before he turned around. Everyone's worried, James said softly, closing the door. Charlotte's asking if she should come find you. The mention of Charlotte's name made Tom's chest tighten further. She'd been on set all morning, watching proudly as her boyfriend worked. Her presence, once a source of comfort, now felt like another weight pressing down on him. I can't do this scene, Tom said, his voice rough. I can't. I can't feel what David's supposed to be feeling. James moved closer, but didn't touch him. What is David supposed to be feeling? Loss, Tom answered automatically. Fear. The realization that everything he thought he knew was. He stopped, the parallel suddenly, painfully clear. Was what, Tom? A lie. The word came out as barely a whisper. He's realizing his whole life has been built on lies he told himself. James took another step forward. They were close now, close enough that Tom could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. And what lies have you been telling yourself? The question broke something open inside Tom. All the carefully constructed walls, the justifications, the excuses, they crumbled like the asylum's decaying plaster. He moved without thinking, closing the distance between them, his hands finding James's face. The kiss was desperate, hungry, filled with weeks of denied longing. James responded immediately, his fingers tangling in Tom's hair, pulling him closer. For a few breathless moments, the world outside ceased to exist. Then, somewhere in the corridor, a door slammed. Tom jerked back as if burned, reality crashing back in. Oh God, he breathed, horror creeping in. Oh God, what am I doing? James reached for him, but Tom stepped away. Tom, wait. I can't. Tom's voice cracked. I can't do this. I'm not. This isn't. He backed toward the door, shaking his head. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He fled the room, barely registering the concerned looks from crew members as he rushed past. He found Michael, mumbled something about feeling ill, and left the set. Charlotte called after him, but he couldn't face her. Not now. Not with the taste of James still on his lips. Tom drove aimlessly for hours, the English countryside blurring past his windows. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from Charlotte, from his agent, from Michael. One from James, whatever you're thinking right now, you're not alone in this. He finally stopped at a small pub in a village he didn't know the name of. The elderly bartender didn't recognize him, or if she did, she had the courtesy not to show it. Tom ordered whiskey and found a dark corner where he could try to make sense of what had happened. The kiss had changed everything and nothing. It had merely made physical what he'd been feeling for weeks, brought into the light what he'd been hiding in the chapel's shadows. But now that it was real, now that he couldn't pretend anymore, what was he supposed to do? His phone buzzed again. "Charlotte, coming back to the hotel soon. We need to talk." Of course they did. She wasn't stupid, she must have sensed something was wrong. Tom had been distant, distracted, spending every free moment with James. He'd been pulling away from her long before today's kiss. The whiskey burned his throat as he thought about his options. He could deny everything, blame stress and exhaustion, finish the film, and return to his carefully constructed life in London. He could try to forget the way James's body felt against his, the way their conversations made him feel more alive than he had in years. Or he could be brave. Not the manufactured bravery of his action roles, but real courage, the kind that meant facing truths about himself he'd been running from his entire life. His phone lit up with another message, this one from James. "Remember what you said about acting being a language for things you couldn't say? Maybe it's time to find the words." Tom stared at the message for a long time, remembering all their conversations in the chapel. They had talked about authenticity, about the courage it takes to be truly seen. James had never pushed, had never demanded anything, but he had created a space where Tom could begin to question everything he'd taken for granted about himself. As night fell outside the pub's windows, Tom thought about the patient from the asylum records, the one living two lives. He thought about his character David, investigating disappearances while being haunted by his own empty spaces. He thought about all the roles he'd played on screen and in life, and wondered what it would feel like to finally, truly be himself. The bartender called last orders. Tom paid his bill and stepped out into the cool night air. He had decisions to make, conversations that couldn't be avoided any longer. His carefully constructed world was falling apart, but maybe, just maybe, something more authentic could rise from its ruins. He got in his car and started the engine, but didn't immediately drive back to the hotel. Instead, he sat there in the darkness, thinking about James's words from weeks ago, "We're all shaped by what's missing as much as by what's present." For the first time in his life, Tom Hardy wasn't missing anything. The empty spaces inside him had been filled with something real, something terrifying and beautiful. Now he just had to find the courage to acknowledge it. The hotel room was dark when Tom finally returned, but he could sense Charlotte was awake. She sat up as he closed the door, switching on the bedside lamp. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "I saw you," she said quietly. "In the side room with James." Tom's heart stopped. He stood frozen by the door, unable to form words. "I was coming to bring you water," Charlotte continued, her voice remarkably steady. The door wasn't completely closed. She looked down at her hands, twisted in the hotel's expensive sheets. "I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at him. Not even me." "Charlotte." Tom moved to sit on the edge of the bed, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish. Please." She took a deep breath. "I've known something was different for weeks. The way you'd light up when he entered a room, how you'd find any excuse to spend time with him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just professional intensity. But today, watching you kiss him, I finally understood." Tom sank into the room's armchair, his legs unable to hold him any longer. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice hoarse. "I never meant to hurt you. I know." Charlotte's smile was sad. "That's what makes it worse, in a way. This isn't something you did to me. It's something that happened to you." She paused, studying his face. "How long have you known about being attracted to men?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "I don't. I've never." He stopped, forced himself to be honest. There were moments, maybe. Feelings I didn't let myself examine too closely. But with James, it's different. It's not just attraction. It's like he sees parts of me I didn't even know existed. Charlotte nodded slowly. I made some calls while you were gone. Booked a flight back to London for tomorrow morning. When Tom started to protest, she shook her head. This isn't punishment, Tom. This is me giving you space to figure out who you are without worrying about hurting me more than you already have. What about the press? Tom asked, his mind racing to the practical implications. The tabloids will. Stop. Charlotte's voice was firm. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're already thinking about your image, your career. But what about your happiness? When was the last time you put that first? The question echoed James's words from their conversations in the chapel, and Tom felt tears burning behind his eyes. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be this person. Charlotte got up and crossed the room to him, kneeling beside his chair. Yes, you do. You're already being him. You're just scared of letting everyone else see. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. You're Tom Hardy. You've played some of the most complex, tortured characters in modern cinema. But maybe it's time to stop playing roles and start living authentically. They talked until dawn, about their relationship, about the future, about the man Tom was finally allowing himself to become. When Charlotte left for the airport, their goodbye was tender but final. They both knew there was no going back. Tom spent the morning in his room, ignoring calls from his agent and publicist. Around noon, there was a knock at his door. It was Michael. James took a few days off, the director said without preamble. Said he needed some space to think. But he left this for you. He handed Tom a manila envelope. Inside was a single page of script, written in James's distinctive handwriting. Int. Asylum Chapel, Day. The detective stands in the dusty light, surrounded by the ghosts of past lives. He understands now that every disappearance he's investigated has been leading him here, to this moment of truth. David. To himself. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing your fears. It's facing yourself. Tom read the words several times, feeling their weight. He thought about all the conversations he and James had had about his character's journey, about authenticity and courage. Only now did he realize they had been talking about him all along. He picked up his phone and opened his email. The first draft went to his agent, a brief, clear message explaining that he needed to make some changes in his life and career. The second was to his publicist, asking her to clear his schedule for the next week. He would need time to figure out how to tell his story on his own terms. The final email was to James. Tom stared at the blank screen for a long time before typing. You once told me that transformation begins with a moment of honest terror. I'm terrified. But for the first time in my life, I'm also completely honest. About who I am. About what I want. About how I feel about you. I understand if you need space. But when you're ready, I'd like to talk. Not in the chapel this time. Somewhere in the real world, where we don't have to hide behind scripts and metaphors. I'm not running anymore. His finger hovered over the send button. Through his window, he could see the asylum's towers reaching toward the sky. Somewhere in those corridors, they would soon finish filming a story about a detective searching for missing people. But Tom's own search was ending. He had finally found himself. He pressed send. 3 days passed without a response from James. Tom threw himself into filming, channeling his anxiety and uncertainty into his performance. The scene that had stumped him before now flowed effortlessly, his character's emotional breakdown felt almost too real. Michael was thrilled, but kept shooting concerned glances at Tom between takes. The tabloids had already caught wind of Charlotte's departure. Their theories ranged from plausible to absurd, but none came close to the truth. Tom's publicist was working overtime, releasing vague statements about mutual decisions and focusing on their careers. It felt strange to Tom, watching the media construct their version of his story while he sat on the real one, waiting for the right moment to tell it. On the fourth day, as autumn rain drummed against the asylum's windows, Tom's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The pier. Tonight at 8. If you're sure. Tom recognized James's writing style immediately. The nearby seaside town had a Victorian pier that stretched out into the dark waters of the North Sea. It would be deserted this time of year, especially in this weather. The hours crawled by. Tom finished his scenes in a daze, barely registering Michael's praise for his performance. By 7:30, he was parking his car in the empty lot near the pier entrance. The rain had settled into a fine mist, creating halos around the pier's vintage lampposts. Tom walked slowly down the wooden boardwalk, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the far end, a solitary figure leaned against the railing, looking out at the darkness where the sea met the sky. James turned as Tom approached, his face half illuminated by the lamplight. He looked tired but resolute, his usual easy confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "I got your email," James said simply. Tom joined him at the railing, their shoulders almost touching. And I needed to be sure you meant it. That this wasn't just a reaction to Charlotte leaving, or the pressure of the film, or... It's not. Tom turned to face him fully. "James, look at me. Please." When their eyes met, Tom felt the same jolt he'd experienced that first day outside the asylum. But this time, he didn't fight it. "I've spent my whole life playing roles," Tom said quietly. "The tough guy, the action hero, the straight leading man. I was so good at it, I almost fooled myself. But then you walked into my life with your questions and your insights, and suddenly all those roles felt hollow." James's hand found his on the railing, their fingers intertwining. "This won't be easy," he warned. "The industry, the media, your fans. I know." Tom squeezed his hand. "But I'm done letting fear dictate my life. You taught me that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we're afraid to tell." The kiss, when it came, was different from their first. There was no desperate hunger, no panic. Instead, it felt like coming home, like finding a truth he'd been searching for his entire life. When they finally broke apart, James rested his forehead against Tom's. "So what happens now?" Tom smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Now we write our own script. No more hiding in chapels or meeting in dark corners. I want to do this right, James. I want to be honest with the world about who I am and who I love. And your career will change. Maybe for better, maybe for worse. But for the first time, I'll be playing myself." Tom pulled back slightly, studying James's face in the lamplight. "Stay with me. Help me figure out how to tell this story." James's answer was another kiss, soft and sure. Above them, the clouds began to break, revealing stars scattered across the dark sky. The sea stretched out endlessly before them, full of possibility. 2 weeks later, the film wrapped. The final scene they shot was in the chapel, now transformed by lighting and set design into something both haunting and beautiful. Tom's character delivered his last lines, words about truth and transformation that felt more personal than ever. As the crew began breaking down equipment, Tom found himself alone in the chapel one last time. The space held so many memories now, conversations that had changed his life, moments of terror and revelation, the first stirrings of a love he'd never expected to find. His phone buzzed with a message from James, "Ready?" Tom took one last look around the chapel, at the dust motes dancing in the pale light, at the shadows where he'd hidden for so long. Then he stepped out into the sunshine, where James was waiting. Tomorrow, they would face the world together. There would be interviews to give, statements to make, battles to fight. But tonight, they would drive to the pier again, walk hand in hand under the stars, and begin writing the next chapter of their story. As they left the asylum grounds for the final time, Tom glanced in his rearview mirror. The Gothic towers stood silhouetted against the setting sun, a reminder of all the lives that had been confined within its walls. But he was free now, free to be himself, free to love openly, free to live without scripts or pretense. The detective had solved his mystery. Tom Hardy had found himself. And this was only the beginning.
Tell us in the comments what part of this story impressed you the most. If you liked it, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next videos. See you in the world of incredible events.